In the autumn of 1947, a maintenance worker at the Henrico County Courthouse in Richmond, Virginia, made a discovery that would unravel one of the most chilling family secrets in the post-Civil War South. Behind a false wall in the basement archives, he found a leather satchel containing documents that told the story of Samuel Washington Pierce, a man whose search for his father's truth led him into the darkest corners of human nature. The courthouse worker, a man named Robert Jenkins, later described the moment as unsettling. The satchel had been deliberately hidden, wrapped in oilcloth, and placed behind what appeared to be a solid brick wall. Only a water leak had revealed the loose mortar that concealed this makeshift vault. Inside, Jenkins found dozens of handwritten pages, some in elegant script, others in hurried, desperate scrawl. At the top of the first page, written in fading ink, were the words, "The true account of my father's chains, as told by his son, Samuel Washington Pierce, Anno Domini 1891. The story began in 1866, in a small settlement called Millbrook, nestled in the rolling hills of central Virginia, approximately 15 miles south of Richmond. It was here that Samuel Pierce first began to question everything he thought he knew about his father, Moses Pierce, and the circumstances of his freedom. Samuel had been born in 1838, the son of Moses Pierce and a woman named Ruth, whose surname was never recorded in any official document. What made Samuel's birth remarkable was not just the timing, 8 years before his father's supposed emancipation, but the fact that Moses Pierce was listed in the 1840 census as a free man of color, owning a small plot of land near the Appomattox River. For 28 years, Samuel had accepted his father's explanation of their family history. Moses Pierce, according to family law, had been born free in North Carolina, had moved to Virginia in his 20s, and had worked as a carpenter and small farmer. The story was simple, believable, and completely false. The first crack in this narrative appeared on a humid July morning in 1866, when Samuel was helping his aging father clear out an old storage shed on their property. Moses, now in his 70s, had been growing increasingly frail, and his son had taken on more responsibility for maintaining their small homestead. As they moved heavy wooden crates that had sat undisturbed for decades, one of them split open, revealing its contents. Inside were chains. Not the rusted farm implements or boat anchors that Samuel might have expected, but unmistakably the iron shackles used to restrain human beings. The metal was dark with age but well preserved, and etched into one of the larger pieces was a name, M. Pierce, and below it a number, 47. When Samuel confronted his father about the discovery, Moses Pierce's reaction was not one of surprise or confusion, but of resignation. The old man sat heavily on a wooden stump and stared at the ground for several long minutes before speaking. "I hoped you would never have to know," he said quietly. "I hoped I could take it with me." What followed was not a confession, but a carefully worded explanation that raised more questions than it answered. Moses Pierce admitted that he had indeed been enslaved, but claimed that the chains had been kept as a reminder of what he had overcome. He insisted that he had purchased his own freedom through years of extra work and had been legally emancipated in 1846. The papers, he said, had been lost in a fire years earlier. Samuel wanted to believe his father, but something about the explanation felt incomplete. The chains they had found were not the simple restraints typically used on plantation workers. They were elaborate, heavy, and bore the marks of long use. Moreover, the number 47 suggested a system of cataloguing that spoke to something far more organized and extensive than a simple plantation operation. Over the following weeks, Samuel found himself studying his father with new eyes. Moses Pierce had always been a quiet man, given to long periods of contemplative silence, But now those silences seemed weighted with unspoken history. The old man would sometimes stop mid-sentence when talking about the past, as if catching himself before revealing too much. It was during this period of growing unease that Samuel began to notice other oddities about his father's behavior. Moses Pierce never slept soundly, often rising in the middle of the night to walk the perimeter of their property. He kept multiple hiding places throughout their small house, and would sometimes count and recount a small collection of gold coins that he kept wrapped in cloth. Most disturbing of all, he would occasionally speak to people who weren't there, carrying on quiet conversations with invisible companions in a voice so low that Samuel couldn't make out the words. The neighbors in Millbrook had always regarded Moses Pierce with a mixture of respect and wariness. He was known as a skilled craftsman who could repair almost anything, but he rarely socialized and never attended community gatherings. Some of the older residents would sometimes make cryptic comments about the Pierce family, referring to things that had happened before the war, or mentioning Moses Pierce's special arrangements with certain prominent families in the area. Samuel's curiosity might have remained just that, idle wondering about a mysterious father, if not for a chance encounter in late August of 1866. While visiting Richmond to sell some of his father's carpentry work, Samuel stopped at a tavern near the James River. There, he overheard a conversation between two elderly white men that would change his understanding of everything. The men were discussing property disputes that had arisen since the end of the war, and one of them mentioned a case involving the estate of a man named Cornelius Whitmore. "Shame about old Whitmore," one of the men said. "Man had some valuable property that just disappeared when he died, including that experimental operation he was running with his coloreds." The other man nodded knowingly. "I heard he had some kind of special arrangement. Kept detailed records too. Wonder what happened to all those papers." Samuel might have dismissed this conversation as typical post-war gossip, except for one detail. He had seen the name Cornelius Whitmore before, carved into a wooden post in his father's workshop. When he returned home and examined the post more carefully, he found not just the name, but a date, 1847, and below that a series of numbers and letters that looked like some kind of code. That night, Samuel confronted his father again, this time armed with the name Cornelius Whitmore. Moses Pierce's reaction was immediate and profound. The color drained from his face, and his hands began to shake. "Where did you hear that name?" he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. When Samuel explained about the conversation in Richmond and the marking in the workshop, his father became agitated in a way Samuel had never seen before. Moses Pierce paced back and forth across their small living area, muttering under his breath, and occasionally stopping to stare out the window, as if expecting to see someone approaching. "You need to forget that name," Moses Pierce finally said. "You need to forget you ever heard it, and you need to stop asking questions about things that are buried and should stay buried." But Samuel's questions had only multiplied. Who was Cornelius Whitmore? What was the experimental operation the men had discussed? Why did the mention of his name terrify his father so completely? And most importantly, what was the truth about those chains they had found? The answers began to come in September of 1866, when Samuel made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Despite his father's warnings, he traveled to the Henrico County Courthouse to search for records related to Cornelius Whitmore and any property transfers that might involve the Pierce family. What he found in those courthouse records was worse than anything he could have imagined. Cornelius Whitmore had been a wealthy landowner who owned several properties in central Virginia, including a large estate near the James River. But Whitmore had also been something else. A man obsessed with what he called the psychology of human bondage, and convinced that traditional plantation systems were inefficient because they failed to break the spirit completely. According to documents filed with the court in 1843, Whitmore had received permission from local authorities to conduct what he described as research into the most effective methods of ensuring complete subjugation of the Negro population. The request had been approved by a panel of 3 judges, all of whom had noted that Whitmore's research could be valuable for maintaining order in the aftermath of growing abolitionist sentiment. The official records were clinical in their language, but they painted a picture of systematic experimentation that went far beyond anything Samuel had imagined possible. Whitmore had been granted permission to acquire subjects for his research through legitimate purchase, and he had been allowed to house them in specially constructed facilities on his property. The subjects, according to the records, would be isolated from other enslaved populations and subjected to various techniques designed to measure and enhance psychological compliance. Samuel found his father's name in a ledger dated 1847. Moses Pierce was listed as Subject 47 and described as male, approximately 35 years, acquired from estate of deceased J. Harrison, documented resistance to authority, selected for long-term study. Next to his father's name was a notation that made Samuel's blood run cold. Excellent subject for isolation techniques, responds well to separation anxiety protocols. But it was the final entry in Moses Pierce's file that revealed the most disturbing truth. In 1854, 7 years after his father had supposedly purchased his own freedom, there was a brief notation: Subject 47 released to independent custody under ongoing observation agreement. Subject retains assigned identification, monitoring to continue indefinitely. Samuel understood now why his father had kept those chains, and why the mention of Cornelius Whitmore's name had terrified him so completely. Moses Pierce had never purchased his freedom at all. He had been released as part of some ongoing experiment, and for over 12 years he had been living under conditions that Samuel was only beginning to understand. That evening, Samuel returned home with copies of every document he had been able to locate. His father was sitting on their front porch, staring out at the road as if he had been waiting. When he saw Samuel approaching with papers in his hand, Moses Pierce simply nodded. "So now you know," he said quietly, "or at least you know part of it." What followed was the most difficult conversation of Samuel's life. His father, freed from the burden of secrecy by his son's discovery, began to tell the true story of his years with Cornelius Whitmore and the experiments that had been conducted at the remote estate near the James River. Whitmore, according to Moses Pierce, had been convinced that traditional methods of maintaining enslaved populations were crude and ineffective. He believed that through careful psychological manipulation, it was possible to create subjects who would police themselves, who would be so thoroughly broken that they would never even consider the possibility of escape or resistance. The techniques Whitmore employed were designed to attack every aspect of a person's sense of self. Subjects were kept in isolation for weeks at a time, then suddenly placed in group settings where they were forced to compete for basic necessities. They were given false information about their families and told that loved ones had died or forgotten them. They were subjected to unpredictable schedules, inconsistent rules, and constant surveillance. But the most insidious aspect of Whitmore's system was something he called voluntary compliance documentation. Subjects were required to write detailed reports about their own psychological state, documenting their fears, their hopes, their strategies for coping with their situation. These reports were then used to design even more targeted forms of psychological pressure. Moses Pierce had spent 7 years as Subject 47, and during that time he had been forced to participate in his own psychological dismantling. He had written hundreds of pages documenting his own mental deterioration, and those pages had been used to develop techniques that were applied to other subjects. The most horrifying revelation was that Whitmore's experiments had not ended with the subject's release. The ongoing observation agreement that had secured Moses Pierce's freedom in 1854 was part of a long-term study designed to measure the lasting effects of the psychological techniques that had been employed. Moses Pierce had been living under surveillance for over 12 years, and everything he did was being documented and analyzed. The gold coins Moses Pierce counted so obsessively were payments he received for monthly reports he was required to submit, detailing his psychological state, his interactions with his family and neighbors, and any thoughts or feelings that might indicate residual resistance to authority. The late-night walks around their property were not just the habits of an insomniac, but part of a security protocol he had been trained to follow. Most devastating of all, Samuel learned that his own birth and upbringing had been part of the experiment. Moses Pierce had been instructed to father children and to raise them according to specific guidelines designed to produce the next generation of psychologically compliant subjects. Every aspect of Samuel's childhood, his education, his social interactions, his relationship with his father, had been carefully orchestrated as part of Whitmore's research. As Samuel absorbed these revelations, he began to understand other aspects of his life that had never quite made sense. His father's insistence on isolation from the broader community, his emphasis on self-reliance and distrust of authority figures, his reluctance to discuss family history, all of these had been elements of an ongoing psychological experiment. But Moses Pierce had not been a passive participant in his son's manipulation. As the years had passed, he had begun to subtly subvert the requirements of his reporting, providing false information to his handlers, and gradually teaching Samuel to think independently, despite the constraints of their situation. The conversations with invisible companions that Samuel had noticed were actually rehearsals. Moses Pierce had been practicing different versions of his monthly reports, trying to craft responses that would satisfy his observers while protecting his son from deeper involvement in the experiment. The hiding places throughout their house contained not just valuables, but copies of every report Moses Pierce had submitted over the years, along with notes documenting the real truth about their family situation. He had been preparing for the day when Samuel would inevitably discover the truth, and he had wanted to ensure that his son would have access to the complete story. Over the following weeks, as Samuel processed the full scope of what he had learned, he began to make plans. He understood that his father was trapped in a situation that had no conventional escape. But he also recognized that the system depended on secrecy and the cooperation of its victims. If that secrecy could be broken, if the truth about Whitmore's experiments could be exposed, it might be possible to free not just his father, but potentially dozens of other subjects who were still living under similar arrangements. Samuel began by researching Whitmore's estate and the current status of the research operation. What he found was that Cornelius Whitmore had died in 1863, but his work had been continued by a group of associates who had formed what they called the Institute for Social Research. The institute operated out of a building in Richmond and claimed to be studying post-war reconstruction techniques, but Samuel recognized it as a continuation of the psychological experiments that had defined his father's life. The Institute's current director was a man named Dr. Frederick Ashford, who had been one of Whitmore's original research partners. According to public records, Dr. Ashford was a respected member of Richmond society, serving on several charitable boards and frequently publishing papers on the psychology of social order in prominent journals. Samuel's plan was straightforward but dangerous. He would gather evidence of the Institute's ongoing operations, document the experiences of as many subjects as possible, and present a comprehensive report to authorities who had not been compromised by association with Whitmore's original research. The risk was enormous. If he was discovered before he could present his evidence, he would likely disappear entirely, joining the ranks of subjects whose questioning had gone too far. The first challenge was identifying other subjects. Samuel knew that his father was not the only person living under ongoing observation, but the subjects had been trained to avoid contact with each other and to maintain the fiction of their normal lives. Samuel would have to find ways to make contact without triggering the surveillance systems that monitored their activities. He began by studying the payment records he had found among his father's papers. The monthly payments Moses Pierce received were drawn on an account at the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Richmond, and the payments followed a pattern that suggested multiple recipients. By observing the bank over several weeks, Samuel was able to identify other individuals who appeared to be collecting similar payments on a regular schedule. One of these individuals was a woman named Charlotte Thompson, who lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Richmond. Like Moses Pierce, she maintained careful routines, avoided social contact, and displayed the subtle signs of someone living under constant psychological pressure. Samuel began following her discreetly, looking for opportunities to make contact without being observed. The opportunity came in October of 1866, when Charlotte Thompson made what appeared to be an unscheduled trip to a cemetery outside Richmond. Samuel followed at a distance and watched as she knelt beside a grave marked only with initials and a date, RT 1849 to 1852. When Charlotte Thompson left the cemetery, Samuel approached the grave and found that someone had left a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside the bundle was a letter written in a careful hand that began, "If someone is reading this, who should not be reading it, know that the truth is bigger than you think, and there are more of us than you know." The letter was signed Subject 31 and contained detailed information about the Institute's current operations. Charlotte Thompson, Samuel realized, was not just another victim of Whitmore's experiments. She was part of an underground network of subjects who had been secretly working to document and resist the ongoing research. The network included more than 20 individuals scattered across Virginia and North Carolina, all of whom had been subjects in Whitmore's original experiments and were now living under various forms of ongoing observation. They had been communicating through an elaborate system of coded messages left in public places, and they had been gathering evidence for years, waiting for the right moment to expose the full scope of what had been done to them. Samuel's discovery of the network marked the beginning of the most dangerous phase of his investigation. The subjects had been planning their exposure for years, but they had been waiting for someone with legal standing, someone who was not officially a subject and therefore not under direct surveillance, to present their evidence to authorities. Samuel understood the weight of what was being asked of him. If he agreed to serve as their representative, he would be committing himself to a course of action that would almost certainly result in his death if he failed. But he also understood that his father and dozens of other people would remain trapped in their psychological prisons unless someone was willing to take that risk. In November of 1866, Samuel made his decision. He would serve as the network's representative and present their evidence to the appropriate authorities. But first, he would document everything they had discovered in a comprehensive written account that could serve as a permanent record of Whitmore's experiments and their ongoing impact. The account Samuel wrote over the following months became the document that was discovered in the courthouse basement in 1947. It contained detailed descriptions of the psychological techniques that had been employed, copies of official documents authorizing the research, transcripts of testimony from multiple subjects, and a complete organizational chart of the Institute and its current operations. But Samuel's account also contained something that the subjects had not expected: evidence that the experiments had been far more extensive than even they had realized. Samuel's research had uncovered connections between Whitmore's institute and similar operations in other states, suggesting a network of psychological research facilities that had been operating throughout the South since the 1840s. The scope of what Samuel had discovered was staggering. Thousands of people had been subjected to systematic psychological experimentation over the course of more than 20 years, and many of them were still living under ongoing observation and control. The network of subjects in Virginia was just one small part of a vast system that had survived the Civil War and was continuing to operate under new justifications and with new funding sources. Samuel's written account concluded with a detailed plan for exposing the entire network and freeing all of its subjects. The plan required careful coordination and precise timing, because the Institute's operators would move quickly to eliminate evidence and silence witnesses if they became aware of the investigation. The plan was never executed. In March of 1867, just as Samuel was preparing to present his evidence to federal authorities in Washington, he disappeared. His father found his room empty one morning, with no signs of struggle and no indication of where he might have gone. Moses Pierce waited for weeks for some word of his son's fate, but no message ever came. The other subjects in the network received word of Samuel's disappearance through their communication system, and they understood immediately what it meant. Their plan had been discovered, and they were now in greater danger than ever before. One by one, the subjects began to disappear as well. Some simply vanished from their homes, while others died in accidents that were carefully staged to appear natural. Moses Pierce lived for 3 more years after his son's disappearance, maintaining the fiction of his normal life while knowing that he was likely being watched even more closely than before. He continued to submit his monthly reports and collect his payments, but he also took steps to ensure that Samuel's written account would survive even if he did not. Moses Pierce died in his sleep in 1870, and his body was found by neighbors who had become concerned when he failed to appear for several days. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but there were aspects of the scene that troubled the local doctor who examined the body. Moses Pierce appeared to have died while sitting at his kitchen table, and on the table were 2 items: a set of keys to various hiding places throughout the house, and a note that read simply, "Tell the true story." The neighbors who found Moses Pierce's body followed his final instructions and searched the hiding places throughout the house. What they found was disturbing enough that they decided to consult with local church authorities rather than involving civil authorities who might have connections to the people mentioned in the documents. The church authorities, after reviewing the evidence, made the decision to hide the documents rather than risk the lives of additional people by attempting to expose the conspiracy. They sealed Samuel's account and the supporting evidence in a leather satchel and concealed it behind a false wall in the courthouse basement, where they hoped it would remain safe until a time when it could be safely revealed. That time never came during their lifetimes, and the secret of the hidden documents was passed down through a small group of church officials who maintained the conspiracy of silence for more than 70 years. It was only the accidental discovery by the maintenance worker in 1947 that finally brought Samuel Pierce's account to light. The maintenance worker, Robert Jenkins, brought the documents to the attention of courthouse officials, who referred them to federal authorities. A quiet investigation was launched, but it quickly ran into obstacles that suggested some elements of the original conspiracy were still active. Several of the federal investigators who began reviewing the case were transferred to other assignments without explanation. Others reported that they were being followed and that their homes had been searched by unknown individuals. The investigation was eventually classified and sealed, with officials citing national security concerns that were never publicly explained. The documents were returned to the courthouse archives, where they remained until 1968, when they were transferred to a federal facility as part of a routine archive reorganization. During the transfer, the satchel containing Samuel Pierce's account disappeared, and its current whereabouts are unknown. The few officials who had reviewed the documents before they disappeared reported that Samuel Pierce's account had identified more than 1,500 individuals who had been subjected to psychological experimentation over a period of more than 40 years. The experiments had continued well into the 20th century, evolving and adapting to new social and political circumstances, but maintaining the same basic goal of studying techniques for psychological control. The scope of the conspiracy suggested a level of coordination and institutional support that extended far beyond what Samuel Pierce had been able to document in his original investigation. Government agencies, academic institutions, and private research organizations had all been involved in supporting and funding the research, creating a network of complicity that made exposure extremely difficult and dangerous. Today, more than 80 years after Samuel Pierce began his investigation into his father's chains, the full truth about Cornelius Whitmore's experiments and their aftermath remains hidden. Researchers who attempt to investigate the case report encountering systematic obstacles, including missing records, sealed archives, and institutional resistance that suggests active efforts to maintain secrecy. The few surviving records that can be found in public archives hint at the scope of what was hidden, but they raise more questions than they answer. Government documents from the 1940s and 1950s contain oblique references to historical research irregularities and legacy subject management protocols that appear to be connected to Whitmore's original research, but the details remain classified or missing. Academic researchers who have attempted to study the psychological techniques developed by Whitmore and his associates report finding fragments of research papers and correspondence that suggest the experiments produced significant advances in understanding human psychological vulnerability. These advances appear to have been incorporated into various government and military programs over the decades, but the connections are carefully obscured and the original research remains inaccessible. What is clear from the available evidence is that Samuel Pierce's investigation uncovered something far more significant and dangerous than a simple case of historical abuse. The psychological experiments that began with Cornelius Whitmore in the 1840s appear to have evolved into an ongoing research program that may have continued well into the modern era. The techniques developed through the systematic torture and psychological manipulation of enslaved people were apparently too valuable to abandon when slavery itself was abolished. Instead, they were refined, expanded, and applied to new populations under new justifications, creating a continuous thread of research that spans more than a century. The subjects of this research were not just the original victims like Moses Pierce, but their children, grandchildren, and successive generations who were born into systems designed to shape and control their psychological development from birth. The experiments Samuel Pierce uncovered were not just studying individual psychological compliance, but were developing techniques for creating entire populations that would police themselves and accept their subjugation as natural and inevitable. The disappearance of Samuel Pierce himself serves as a reminder of the lengths to which the operators of these programs would go to protect their secrets. His investigation had come too close to exposing not just the historical record of past abuses, but the ongoing operations that were still active and expanding. The few people who have attempted to continue Samuel Pierce's work have encountered similar obstacles and faced similar dangers. Researchers have disappeared, archives have been mysteriously destroyed, and witnesses have died in suspicious circumstances that effectively discourage further investigation. But Samuel Pierce's legacy is not entirely lost. The network of subjects he discovered had spent years documenting their experiences and gathering evidence, and while many of them were eliminated after his disappearance, some of their records survived in hiding places that were never discovered. These fragments continue to surface occasionally, providing glimpses into the full scope of what was hidden. The courage Samuel Pierce showed in pursuing the truth about his father's chains, despite the enormous personal risk, serves as an inspiration for those who continue to seek answers about one of the darkest chapters in American history. His investigation revealed not just the horror of what was done to individuals like Moses Pierce, but the systematic nature of programs designed to study and enhance techniques for psychological control. The questions Samuel Pierce raised about accountability and justice remain relevant today. The men who designed and implemented these experiments were never held responsible for their actions. In many cases, they were celebrated as distinguished researchers and community leaders, their crimes hidden behind classifications and institutional protections that persist to this day. The victims of these experiments, like Moses Pierce, were forced to live their entire lives under conditions of psychological imprisonment, unable to escape even after their physical chains were removed. Their suffering was compounded by the knowledge that their experiences were being studied and used to perfect techniques that would be applied to others. The children and grandchildren of these victims, like Samuel Pierce himself, grew up in an environment shaped by trauma they could not understand and psychological manipulation they could not identify. Many of them lived their entire lives without understanding the true nature of their circumstances, accepting the limitations and fears that had been carefully cultivated as part of their family's legacy. The broader implications of these experiments extend far beyond their immediate victims. The techniques developed through this research appear to have been incorporated into various institutional and governmental programs over the decades, influencing approaches to education, criminal justice, military training, and social control that continue to affect millions of people today. Understanding the historical roots of these techniques and the methods used to develop them is essential for recognizing their ongoing application and resisting their effects. Samuel Pierce's investigation provides a roadmap for uncovering institutional crimes that are designed to remain hidden, and his approach to building networks of resistance among the victims themselves offers a model for organizing against systematic oppression. The story of Samuel Pierce and his father's chains is ultimately a story about the power of truth and the courage required to pursue it in the face of overwhelming opposition. It is also a reminder that some truths are considered too dangerous to reveal, and that those who seek to expose them must be prepared to pay the ultimate price for their commitment to justice. The chains Moses Pierce kept as a reminder of his suffering were not just symbols of his physical bondage, but evidence of a systematic program designed to create psychological bondage that would outlast any legal emancipation. The discovery of those chains led Samuel Pierce to uncover a conspiracy that extended far beyond anything he could have imagined, and his investigation revealed the true scope of programs that continue to shape American society today. The silence that surrounds this case is not accidental or incidental, but is actively maintained by institutions that have a vested interest in keeping these secrets hidden. The disappearance of documents, the classification of records, and the systematic obstruction of research into these topics are not bureaucratic accidents, but deliberate policies designed to protect ongoing operations and prevent accountability for historical crimes. Those who attempt to break this silence face risks that go far beyond professional or academic consequences. The fate of Samuel Pierce and the other subjects who tried to expose these experiments serves as a warning that some knowledge is considered too dangerous to possess, and that institutions will take extreme measures to protect their secrets. But the truth has a way of surviving even the most systematic efforts to suppress it. The fragments of evidence that continue to surface, the testimonies that survive in hidden records, and the ongoing effects of these programs that can be observed in contemporary society all point to a reality that cannot be entirely concealed. Samuel Pierce's investigation into his father's chains opened a door that those in power have been trying to close for more than a century. His courage in pursuing the truth, despite the personal cost, created a legacy that continues to inspire those who seek to expose institutional crimes and demand accountability for historical injustices. The chains that Moses Pierce saved were not just evidence of what had been done to him, but a testament to his determination to ensure that the truth would eventually be revealed. Through his son's investigation and the network of resistance that Samuel discovered, those chains became the key that unlocked one of the darkest secrets in American history. Today, more than 75 years after Samuel Pierce's disappearance, his investigation remains incomplete. The full scope of the experiments he uncovered has never been revealed. The perpetrators have never been held accountable, and the victims have never received justice. But his work continues through those who refuse to let these crimes remain hidden and who continue to seek the truth about one of the most systematic and long-lasting programs of psychological experimentation in human history. The disturbing legacy of Cornelius Whitmore and his associates serves as a reminder that the capacity for institutional evil is not limited to distant historical periods or foreign regimes. The techniques they developed and the programs they established operated for decades within American institutions, protected by secrecy and enabled by the complicity of respected members of society. Understanding this history is essential for recognizing how similar programs might operate today, and for developing the vigilance necessary to prevent their continuation. The psychological techniques that were developed through the systematic torture and manipulation of enslaved people have evolved and adapted over time. But their fundamental purpose, to create psychological compliance and prevent resistance to authority, remains unchanged. Samuel Pierce's investigation provides a model for uncovering and resisting these programs, but it also demonstrates the enormous personal cost that such resistance can entail. Those who choose to pursue this truth must be prepared for the consequences, and they must understand that they are challenging forces that have demonstrated their willingness to eliminate threats to their secrecy. The chains that started Samuel Pierce on his investigation were physical objects that could be held and examined, but they represented psychological chains that were far more difficult to identify and break. The true horror of what Moses Pierce endured was not just the physical restraint, but the systematic destruction of his sense of self and his ability to imagine freedom. The experiments that Cornelius Whitmore conducted were designed to create a form of psychological slavery that would be more complete and more durable than physical bondage. The techniques he developed were intended to make resistance not just difficult or dangerous, but literally unthinkable for his subjects. Samuel Pierce's investigation revealed that these techniques had been remarkably successful, not just in controlling individual subjects, but in creating systems of psychological control that could be maintained across generations. The children and grandchildren of the original subjects were born into environments that had been carefully designed to shape their psychological development and limit their capacity for independent thought. The ongoing surveillance and control that Moses Pierce lived under for more than 20 years was not just punishment for his past resistance, but an active research program designed to study the long-term effects of psychological conditioning and to develop new techniques for maintaining control over populations. The reports that Moses Pierce was required to submit were not just monitoring tools, but data collection instruments that provided researchers with detailed information about the psychological state of their subjects and the effectiveness of various control techniques. This information was then used to refine and improve the methods used to maintain psychological control over other subjects. The network of subjects that Samuel Pierce discovered was itself part of the experiment, as researchers studied how victims of psychological conditioning would interact with each other and whether they would be capable of organizing effective resistance. The surveillance of this network provided valuable data about the limits of the control techniques and the circumstances under which subjects might begin to recover their capacity for independent action. Samuel Pierce's investigation was allowed to proceed as far as it did because it provided researchers with unprecedented insights into how subjects would respond to the discovery of truth about their situation. His documentation of the network and his plans for resistance gave the researchers a complete picture of how their techniques could be overcome and what countermeasures would be necessary to prevent future resistance. The disappearance of Samuel Pierce and the systematic elimination of the subject network was not just a defensive action to protect the secrecy of the programs, but a continuation of the research itself. The researchers were studying how effectively they could eliminate resistance movements and how completely they could suppress attempts to expose their operations. The decades of secrecy that have surrounded this case are not just the result of institutional inertia or bureaucratic obstruction, but represent an active policy of concealment that is maintained because the research programs themselves continue to operate. The techniques developed by Cornelius Whitmore and refined through decades of experimentation are still being applied today, and exposure of their historical origins would threaten current operations. The courage that Samuel Pierce showed in pursuing this investigation, despite the enormous personal risk, represents one of the most important examples of resistance to systematic psychological oppression in American history. His willingness to sacrifice his own safety for the sake of truth and justice created a legacy that continues to inspire those who face similar choices today. The chains that Moses Pierce kept were more than just physical artifacts. They were symbols of a form of bondage that was designed to be invisible and permanent. Samuel Pierce's investigation transformed those chains from symbols of victimization into tools of resistance and revelation. The true measure of Samuel Pierce's courage is not just that he was willing to risk his life to expose these crimes, but that he was able to break through psychological conditioning that had been specifically designed to make such resistance impossible. His ability to see through the carefully constructed fiction of his family's normal life and to question the fundamental assumptions that had shaped his world represents a triumph of human consciousness over systematic manipulation. The network of subjects that Samuel Pierce discovered had achieved something that their oppressors had believed to be impossible. They had overcome the psychological conditioning that was designed to keep them isolated and compliant, and they had organized effective resistance to their continued exploitation. Their ability to maintain secret communications and coordinate their activities for years without detection represents one of the most successful resistance movements in the history of psychological oppression. The documentation that these subjects created, despite the enormous risks involved, provides some of the most detailed and reliable evidence available about the nature and scope of systematic psychological experimentation conducted by American institutions. Their testimonies reveal not just what was done to them individually, but how techniques of psychological control were developed, tested, and refined over decades of systematic research. The fate of these brave individuals serves as both an inspiration and a warning for those who might consider similar resistance today. Their courage in documenting their experiences and seeking justice for their suffering created a historical record that survives despite systematic efforts to suppress it, but their elimination also demonstrates the lengths to which those in power will go to protect their secrets. Samuel Pierce's investigation into his father's chains ultimately revealed chains that were far more extensive and more durable than anything he could have imagined. The physical chains that had bound Moses Pierce were just the visible symbol of psychological chains that had been designed to bind not just individuals, but entire communities and generations. The discovery of this truth came at an enormous cost, but it also created possibilities for understanding and resistance that did not exist before. Samuel Pierce's courage in pursuing this investigation, despite knowing the likely consequences, opened a door that cannot be completely closed, and created a legacy that continues to inspire those who seek to understand and resist systematic oppression. The questions that Samuel Pierce raised about accountability and justice remain unanswered today, but his investigation provided a roadmap for continuing the search for truth, and his example continues to inspire those who face similar choices. The chains he discovered may have been more extensive than he imagined, but his courage in confronting them created possibilities for freedom that those who forged the chains had believed to be impossible. The story of Samuel Washington Pierce and his investigation into his father's chains is ultimately a story about the power of truth to survive even the most systematic efforts to suppress it, and about the courage required to pursue that truth in the face of overwhelming opposition. It is a reminder that some truths are considered too dangerous to reveal, but also that those truths have a way of surfacing despite all efforts to keep them buried. The chains that Moses Pierce saved as a reminder of his suffering became, through his son's courage and sacrifice, the key that unlocked one of the most important and disturbing secrets in American history. The investigation that began with the discovery of those chains revealed a conspiracy that extends far beyond anything most people could imagine, but it also demonstrated that even the most systematic and sophisticated forms of oppression can be challenged and exposed by those who have the courage to seek the truth. And perhaps, in the end, that is Samuel Pierce's greatest legacy. Not just the specific truths he uncovered, but the example he provided of what becomes possible when someone refuses to accept the limitations that have been placed on their understanding and demands to know the real truth about their world, no matter what the cost might be.